Imagine a world where the line between criminal and statesman is so blurred it becomes invisible. Picture a man who never fired a gun in anger, yet commanded an army of thousands. A man who preferred the quiet halls of political power to the bloody streets of gangland warfare. This is not a fictional tale, but the real, shocking story of Frank Costello, the man who truly invented organized crime as we know it. Before you immerse yourself in this detailed account, we must state that this entire narrative has been pieced together from historical records, declassified government documents, court transcripts, and biographies of those who knew him. Our sole purpose is to present you with the most accurate and comprehensive story to ensure the truth of this incredible chapter in American history is not lost to time. So, if you are ready to journey into the shadowy heart of the 20th century to understand how one man's ambition forged a clandestine empire, then settle in and listen closely. This is the story of the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Our story begins not in the glittering casinos or the smoke-filled back rooms of power, but in the dusty, sun-baked villages of Calabria, Italy. It was here in 1891 that a boy named Francesco Castiglia was born into a world of poverty and limited prospects. His early years were shaped by the harsh realities of southern Italian life, a place where respect was everything and family was the only institution you could truly trust. This environment, though distant from the skyscrapers of Manhattan, was the perfect crucible for forging a certain kind of resilience, an understanding of codes of honor and silence that would later define his life. When Francesco was just 4 years old, his family, like millions of others, made the arduous decision to seek a new life across the Atlantic. They arrived at Ellis Island, that great gateway of hope and desperation, and were processed into the chaotic, teeming melting pot of New York City. They settled in East Harlem, which was then known as Italian Harlem, a crowded, vibrant, and often violent neighborhood where new immigrants clung together for survival. The Castiglia family struggled to find their footing in this new world. It was here that young Francesco first saw the stark contrast between immense wealth and grinding poverty, a sight that would forever shape his worldview. He saw that the American dream was not simply given, it was taken. And he quickly learned that the quickest path out of poverty often lay outside the boundaries of the law. The streets of East Harlem were his real school. He ran with a gang of young kids, mostly other Italian immigrants, learning the arts of petty theft and street-level extortion. It was during these formative years that he first began to understand the power of influence and the importance of reputation. He was not the largest or the most physically intimidating boy, but he possessed a sharp mind and a calm, calculating demeanor that set him apart. He understood that brute force alone was a clumsy tool. Real power came from persuasion, from deals, from the quiet threat that never needed to be spoken aloud. It was also during this time that he Americanized his name, becoming Frank Costello, shedding the old world identity like a worn-out coat, believing that a new name could help build a new future. The young Frank Costello's criminal education accelerated rapidly. He graduated from petty crime to more serious offenses, including robbery and assault. He was ambitious and saw the established criminals in his neighborhood not as villains, but as successful businessmen. He wanted what they had, but he already knew he wanted to acquire it in a different way. He observed the flashy, violent gangsters who often ended up dead or in prison, and he made a conscious decision to avoid their fate. He was arrested for the first time at the age of 15, a minor charge that was just the beginning of a long and complex relationship with the law. This early brush with the justice system did not deter him. Instead, it educated him. He began to see the law not as an immovable wall, but as a system with cracks, a game that could be played and won with the right strategy and the right friends. His reputation as a smart and reliable young man grew, catching the attention of more powerful figures in the neighborhood's criminal hierarchy. He became associated with a formidable gang known as the 104th Street Gang, which included other future legends of the underworld like Charles, Lucky, Luciano. This association was pivotal. In Luciano, Costello found a kindred spirit, another young man who saw the old-fashioned, violence, obsessed ways of the mustache Pete's as obsolete. Together, they would begin to dream of a different kind of criminal enterprise, one that was structured, corporate, and far more powerful than the disorganized street gangs of their youth. Costello's early adulthood was interrupted by the onset of the First World War. He was drafted into the United States Army, an experience that, for a brief period, pulled him out of the criminal world and into a structured, hierarchical organization. Some biographers suggest this military experience further refined his understanding of chain of command and large-scale organization, lessons he would later apply to his criminal empire. Upon his return from service, he did not return to simple street crime. He was a man now, with a broader perspective and greater ambitions. The world was changing, and a monumental shift was on the horizon. A change that would create unprecedented opportunities for men with the vision and the nerve to seize them. That change was Prohibition. The Volstead Act, which came into effect in 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, was the single greatest stimulus package for organized crime in American history. It was the moment Frank Costello had been waiting for. He saw immediately that this was not just a chance to make money. It was a chance to build an empire. The public demand for alcohol was insatiable, and the law had created a multi-billion-dollar black market overnight. Costello, along with his partners like Luciano, dove headfirst into bootlegging, but while others focused on the violent aspects of the trade, the turf wars, the hijackings, Costello focused on the machinery. He understood that the real key to success was not in controlling the streets, but in controlling the supply, the distribution, and most importantly, the political and legal protection that would allow the business to flourish. He began to cultivate relationships with politicians, judges, and police officers, using a combination of bribery, charm, and implied threat. He became a master of the fix, the man you went to when you needed a problem to disappear. This was the genesis of his nickname, the Prime Minister. He was the diplomat, the strategist, the back-room dealer. He built a vast and efficient rum-running operation, using boats to bring high-quality liquor from Europe and Canada, distributing it through a complex network of speakeasies and distributors. The money that flowed in was astronomical, beyond anything he could have imagined on the streets of East Harlem. This wealth allowed him to dress in the finest suits, frequent the most exclusive clubs, and present himself not as a thug, but as a successful, if mysterious, businessman. It was during the Prohibition era that the foundation of the modern American mafia was poured, and Frank Costello was one of its chief architects, working in the shadows to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become known as the Commission, the governing body of the National Crime Syndicate. The immense wealth and influence generated by Prohibition did not just buy Frank Costello fine suits and a veneer of respectability. It purchased something far more valuable, a permanent seat at the table of power. While the public spectacle of the Roaring Twenties was defined by flappers and jazz, the true engine of the era thrummed in the hidden basements and backrooms, where men like Costello quietly reassembled the gears of society to their own benefit. His approach was revolutionary. He understood that violence was a tax on business, a messy, unpredictable variable that attracted unwanted attention from the press and, more importantly, from federal investigators. His genius lay in his ability to monetize peace, to become the underworld's supreme arbitrator and insulator. This philosophy positioned him perfectly for the next great upheaval within the criminal fraternity, a conflict that would come to be known as the Castellammarese War. This was not a street war in the conventional sense. It was a brutal, corporate takeover struggle for the soul of the Italian underworld in America. On one side stood the old guard, the mustache peteets, led by Salvatore Maranzano, men steeped in ancient Sicilian traditions who viewed crime as a matter of honor and village loyalty. On the other side was a new generation of hungry, Americanized young Turks, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Costello himself, who saw crime as a pure business, a multinational corporation whose only god was profit. Costello, ever the strategist, did not lead charging gunmen into battle. His role was far more critical. He was the banker and the diplomat. He used his vast financial resources to fund the Young Turks campaign, ensuring their soldiers were paid, their lawyers were retained, and their families were cared for. More importantly, he worked his political connections to ensure that the police pressure fell disproportionately on the old guard, manipulating the forces of law and order as a weapon in a gangland conflict. The war culminated not just with the dramatic murder of Maranzano, but with the visionary reorganization of American crime. Luciano, now the preeminent leader, created the Commission, a board of directors for the National Syndicate, comprising the bosses of the 5 New York families and key figures from other cities like Chicago. It was designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and enforce contracts, thereby preventing future bloody wars. In this new corporate structure, Frank Costello was appointed the consigliere, or chief advisor, to Luciano himself, but his influence stretched far beyond an advisory role. He was the Syndicate's chief lobbying firm, its public relations arm, and its legal defense fund, all rolled into one. His power base was unique and virtually unassailable. He controlled the slot machines. This may sound trivial, but in the 1930s and 40s, slot machines were a technological revolution in gambling, a low, overhead, high profit industry that was incredibly difficult to eradicate. Costello's empire wasn't confined to shadowy back alleys. His own armed bandits were everywhere, in corner candy stores, neighborhood bars, restaurant foyers, and union halls. He had a virtual monopoly on them in New York City, and his network extended to New Orleans, Florida, and across the country. Each machine was a silent, relentless collector of coins, a mechanical soldier in his army, generating a river of untaxed, untraceable cash that flowed directly into his coffers. This cash was the lifeblood of his power. It was fluid, immediate, and perfect for the corruption that was his true specialty. He didn't just bribe cops on the beat, he corrupted the very system. He had judges, city councilmen, borough presidents, and even congressmen on his payroll. He cultivated these relationships with the skill of a master courtier. He never crudely demanded favors. He offered mutually beneficial partnerships. He provided campaign contributions, solved tricky problems for politicians, and ensured a steady flow of graft to the right pockets. In return, he received something priceless: immunity. Arrests would be quashed. Investigations would be steered in the wrong direction, and lucrative city contracts would be awarded to his associates. He became a legendary figure in Tammany Hall, the corrupt democratic political machine that ran New York City, not as a thug to be feared, but as a power broker to be respected. His most famous and crucial relationship was with a Tammany Hall titan named James J. Hines. Hines was the political boss of much of Manhattan, a man who could deliver votes, sway judges, and control district attorney offices. Costello's alliance with Hines was a masterpiece of symbiotic corruption. The cash from the slot machines and other rackets flowed to Hines, who in turn used his immense political power to create a protective bubble around Costello's entire operation. This allowed Costello to operate with an openness that was breathtaking. He held court at his favorite tables in exclusive nightclubs like the Copacabana, rubbing shoulders with celebrities, business magnates, and politicians. He was a regular at the Waldorf-Astoria hotel, where he maintained a suite and conducted his business with the calm authority of a corporate CEO. This was his ultimate creation, a life where he was both a king of the underworld and a respected denizen of the upper world. He had achieved what no gangster before him had managed. He had made crime not just profitable, but respectable, stable, and safe. The end of Prohibition had broken lesser gangsters, but for Costello, it was merely a shift in portfolio. He diversified into legitimate businesses like real estate and oil, using them to launder his illicit earnings, while his gambling and political interests continued to generate phenomenal wealth and power. He was at the absolute zenith of his influence. a man who truly believed he had transcended the violent roots of his profession and had become, in every meaningful sense, untouchable. He was the Prime Minister, and his parliament was the entire city of New York. The perception of being untouchable, a carefully cultivated and meticulously maintained illusion, is often the prelude to a devastating fall. For Frank Costello, the meticulously constructed edifice of his power began to develop hairline fractures from a direction he had long considered secure: his own family. The end of the Second World War ushered in a new America, one less tolerant of the open corruption of the past, and a new generation of law enforcement aimed its sights directly at the shadowy figures who had thrived in the chaos of Prohibition and the Depression. The first major tremor came not from a rival gangster or a zealous district attorney, but from a United States Senator from Tennessee, a man named Estes Kefauver. In 1950, the Senate established the Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, with Kefauver as its chairman. This was no ordinary investigation. It was a media spectacle, one of the first major congressional hearings to be broadcast on television, bringing the grim realities of the underworld directly into the living rooms of millions of Americans. For weeks, the nation was captivated as a parade of gangsters, bookmakers, and corrupt politicians were grilled under the hot lights of the cameras. But the entire nation was waiting for one man, Frank Costello. He was the star witness, the man the committee believed was the central nervous system of the entire national crime syndicate. Costello, understanding the power of imagery, refused to allow his face to be televised, a negotiation that resulted in the cameras focusing intently, dramatically, on his hands. It was a pivotal miscalculation. Those hands, fidgeting, clenching, wiping sweat from his brow, twisting a watch on his wrist, told a story more eloquent than any words could. They were the hands of a man under immense strain, and to the public, they betrayed the calm, unflappable persona he had presented to the world for decades. He invoked the Fifth Amendment over 100 times, but the damage was done. The image of those nervous hands became an enduring symbol of guilt in the public consciousness. The Kefauver hearings did not send him to prison, but they did something far worse. They stripped him of his anonymity and his respectability. He was no longer a mysterious businessman who knew politicians. He was now nationally, publicly, and indelibly branded as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The protective cloak of political connections began to fray as the public outrage, fueled by the hearings, forced politicians to distance themselves from their former benefactor. His alliance with James Hines had already crumbled years earlier, with Hines himself being convicted and imprisoned. But now no one in power wanted to be associated with the man whose face, or rather whose hands, had been on every television screen in America. The second, and far more dangerous, threat emerged from within his own organization. For years, Costello had ruled with a light touch, believing that reason and profit were stronger motivators than fear. He had a designated underboss, a ruthless and ambitious man named Vito Genovese, who had been scheming in the background for years to seize power. Genovese was everything Costello was: not volatile, deeply traditional, and a firm believer in violence as the ultimate tool of leadership. He saw Costello's diplomatic, political approach as a weakness, a relic of a bygone era. While Costello lunched at the Waldorf, Genovese was in the streets, consolidating power, making promises, and plotting a coup. The pressure on Costello was mounting from all sides. The federal government, emboldened by the Kefauver hearings, was now relentlessly pursuing him for tax evasion, the same weapon that had finally felled Al Capone. The world he had built, a world that operated on handshake deals and quiet understandings, was being dismantled by subpoenas, wiretaps, and the relentless scrutiny of the modern state. He was convicted on tax charges in 1954 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Although he would win an appeal and a new trial, the legal battles were a constant drain, both financially and psychologically. The man who had fixed cases for others now found himself trapped in a legal labyrinth from which there seemed no easy exit. The final, unmistakable signal that his reign was over came on the evening of May 2, 1957. Costello was returning to his apartment, building on Central Park West, after a dinner at a nearby restaurant. As he walked through the ornate lobby, a man stepped forward and called his name. As Costello turned, the man, a Genovese gunman named Vincent, the Chin, Gigante, raised a pistol and fired a single shot. The bullet grazed Costello's head, leaving a bloody but superficial wound. It was a classic gangland warning, not a kill shot, intended to demonstrate the shooter's precision and the target's vulnerability. In that moment, bleeding on the plush carpet of his own expensive apartment building, the entire philosophy of Frank Costello was proven tragically naive. He had believed he could rise above the violence, that his intellect and connections made him immune to the base rules of the underworld. The bullet from Gigante's gun was Genovese's way of telling him he was wrong. The attempted assassination was the underworld's vote of no confidence. In a stunning act that sealed his fate, Costello, when questioned by police, refused to identify his assailant. He famously told the detectives, "I don't know who could have done this. I don't have an enemy in the world." It was a final, dignified, and utterly futile adherence to the old code of Omert. But his power was gone, evaporating in an instant. He knew that to name Gigante was to declare all-out war on Genovese, a war he no longer had the stomach or the street level support to win. The message was received and understood by every power broker in the city. Shortly thereafter, he formally stepped down, ceding control of what was now the Genovese crime family to the man who had tried to have him killed. Frank Costello, the prime minister, had been peacefully and then violently deposed. His empire of slot machines and political favors was dismantled, his influence dissipated. He spent his remaining years as a ghost of his former self, a respected but powerless elder statesman, living on his wealth, but forever looking over his shoulder, a permanent resident of the shadowy world he had tried so hard to transcend. The abdication of a king is never a quiet affair, even when it happens without a formal proclamation. Frank Costello's surrender of power to veto Genovese was a seismic event that reverberated through every corridor of the American underworld, signaling the end of one era and the brutal dawn of another. His retirement was not a peaceful retreat to a life of golf and leisure. It was a protracted, humbling withdrawal from the world he had dominated. A forced exile played out in the same city that had once been his personal fiefdom. The man who had once held court at the Waldorf-Astoria now found his circle of associates shrinking, his phone ringing less frequently, his counsel no longer sought by the powerful. He still possessed immense wealth, a fortune salted away in real estate and legitimate businesses, but the true currency of his life, influence, was now worthless. He became a living monument to a bygone age, a reminder of a time when organized crime had aspirations of legitimacy, a time before the relentless glare of television cameras and the dogged persistence of federal prosecutors. The world was changing rapidly, and the new generation of mobsters, led by the paranoid and ruthless Genovese, had no use for a diplomat. They were soldiers, traffickers in heroin and violence, who viewed Costello's methods as quaint and obsolete. Genovese, now ensconced as the new boss, sought to consolidate his power and legitimize his position by calling a historic summit of mob leaders from across the country. This meeting, held in the sleepy, upstate New York town of Appalachian in November of 1957, was intended to be Genovese's coronation, a display of his national authority. Instead, it became one of the greatest debacles in the history of organized crime, an event that would ultimately vindicate Costello's philosophy of quiet discretion while simultaneously destroying the last vestiges of the secrecy he had so cherished. A suspicious state trooper noticed the influx of expensive cars and men with Italian surnames gathering at the estate of mobster Joseph Barbara, and soon roadblocks were set up. The resulting panic saw dozens of the most powerful crime lords in America scrambling through the woods and fields in their fine suits, being rounded up and humiliated. The Appalachian meeting exposed the existence of a national crime syndicate to the public in a way the Kefauver hearings never could. It was tangible, irrefutable proof, and it unleashed an unprecedented wave of law enforcement scrutiny from which the mob would never fully recover. For Costello, watching from the sidelines, it must have been a moment of bitter satisfaction. Genovese's heavy-handed, egotistical attempt to seize the mantle had backfired catastrophically, proving that Costello's low-profile approach had been the correct one all along. But this satisfaction was cold comfort. The fallout from Appalachian ensured that every man who had attended and every man associated with them was now a permanent target. The age of the public boss was over before it had even begun. Costello's own legal troubles, temporarily stayed by his appeal, now returned with renewed vigor. The government, armed with new tools and a new mandate after Appalachian, was determined to make an example of him. In 1959, he was retried on the tax evasion charges. This time, the outcome was different. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The man who had manipulated the levers of justice for 4 decades was now, finally, a prisoner of the system he had so masterfully gamed. His incarceration was not the brutal experience of a common convict. He served his time at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, often in less restrictive conditions, but it was nonetheless a profound and symbolic defeat. He was an old man now, in his late 60s, and the routine and regimentation of prison life were a stark contrast to the power and freedom he had once known. He was released after serving just under 3 years, but the world to which he returned in 1961 was alien to him. The mob was fractured, paranoid, and under siege. Genovese himself was now in prison, having been set up in a bogus drug deal by his own subordinates, including a young and ambitious capo named Carlo Gambino. The irony was thick. The man who had overthrown Costello through violence had himself been brought down by the very treachery he embodied. Costello was now truly a figure from the past, a relic. He maintained a small office in New York, dabbling in his remaining real estate holdings, but he was careful, always careful, to stay far away from the rackets that had defined his life. He knew the government was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. He became a ghost, a whispered name from a history that was rapidly receding. The new bosses, men like Gambino, would occasionally seek his advice, a gesture of respect for the old order, but they ran their families according to a new, more volatile model. The calm, political authority that Costello had wielded was gone, replaced by a cycle of internal betrayals and bloody purges. He lived out this final chapter for 12 long years, a king in exile, witnessing the slow, steady decline of the empire he had helped build. He saw the rise of the FBI's electronic surveillance, the passage of the RICO Act, which gave prosecutors a devastating new weapon, and the gradual transformation of the Mafia from a shadow government into a beleaguered criminal subculture. He spent his final days in his East Side apartment, a man of immense wealth and immense silence, his mind a vast archive of secrets that would never be told. On February 18, 1973, at the age of 82, Frank Costello died of a heart attack. His death was not dramatic, it was quiet and private, a final departure that stood in stark contrast to the violent ends of so many of his contemporaries. He was buried in a mausoleum in St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, his name etched in stone, a permanent and ambiguous part of American history. He left behind no great public works, no charitable foundations that bore his name, only a complex and troubling legacy. He was a criminal, a corrupter of institutions, a man who profited from the weaknesses of society. Yet, he was also a visionary of sorts, the architect of a system that, for a time, brought a strange and bloody order to the American underworld. He demonstrated that power could be wielded not just with a gun, but with a telephone, a suitcase of cash, and a quiet word in the right ear. His story is a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of power and the fragile boundary between the legitimate and the illicit worlds. It is a reminder that the most dangerous men are not always the ones who shout and kill, but often the ones who sit in the background, calmly and patiently pulling the strings. The death of Frank Costello did not, as one might have expected, draw a final curtain on his story. Instead, it opened a new and complex postscript, one where his legacy was dissected, debated, and ultimately scattered across the shifting landscape of memory and history. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the obituaries in the mainstream press struggled to categorize him. He was not a folk hero like some gangsters of the Depression era, nor was he a monstrous figure of pure evil. He was presented as an anomaly, a paradox, a criminal who shunned violence, a kingpin who coveted respectability. This very ambiguity is what has ensured his enduring fascination. For historians and crime aficionados, Costello became the quintessential case study of a critical transition point in organized crime. The move from the garish, street-level brutality of the 1920s to the corporate, politically entwined model that defined the mid-century. His life serves as a blueprint, a detailed map of how illicit power can be institutionalized. The systems he helped pioneer, particularly the Commission and the intricate web of political protection, became the standard operating procedure for the American Mafia for decades. Even as the organization began its long, slow decline following the revelations of Apollochen and the subsequent government assaults, the foundational structures Costello helped lay remained in place. His ghost lingered in the methods of every mob boss who understood that a friendly judge was more valuable than a dozen hitmen. Yet, his personal philosophy, his belief in diplomacy over demolition, largely died with him. The generations that followed, the gaudy era of the 1980s, with its flamboyant and self-destructive bravado, proved that his lessons had been forgotten, that the subtle art of the Prime Minister had been replaced by the crude theatrics of the dawn. The fate of his vast fortune remains a subject of much speculation and mystery. While he lived a life of undeniable luxury, it was never as ostentatious as his wealth could have allowed. He invested heavily in real estate, including valuable properties in Manhattan and lucrative oil ventures in Texas, all channels for laundering his enormous illicit earnings from gambling and racketeering. Unlike the flashy, cash-heavy displays of his successors, Costello's wealth was quietly converted into assets, bricks, and mortar, a testament to his long-term vision. The exact disposition of his estate was a private matter, but it is believed that the bulk of it was left to his wife, Bobby, with whom he had shared a long and notably stable marriage, a rarity in his turbulent world. There were no vast charitable bequests, no public foundations established with his tainted money. The wealth accumulated through a lifetime of slot machines, fixed races, and political payoffs was ultimately absorbed back into the legitimate economy, its origins blurred and forgotten. A final, fitting act of laundering for the man who had perfected the process. Beyond the money, his legacy persists in the cultural imagination. Frank Costello became a template for a certain archetype in film and literature, the sophisticated, cerebral gangster who operates from a position of intellectual superiority, while characters like Vito Corleone are often linked to other real-life figures. The Don's strategic mind, his desire for legitimacy, and his preference for negotiation bear the unmistakable imprint of Costello's real, life story. He is the gangster as CEO, a figure who understood that the balance sheet was more important than the body count. This portrayal, however, often sanitizes the grim reality of his business. It is crucial to remember that the rivers of cash that flowed into his coffers were sourced from human weakness and despair. The addiction of the gambler, the corruption of the public official, the systemic decay of civic institutions. The elegant man in the tailored suit was still the master of a vast criminal enterprise that inflicted real harm on society. The calm, narrative style of this account should not obscure the fundamental truth of his life. He was a master criminal. His ability to avoid the bloody work himself did not make him less culpable. It simply made him more effective and more dangerous. He corrupted the very foundations of democracy, proving that a bribe in the right hand could be more powerful than a ballot in the hands of thousands. His story is a permanent warning about the vulnerability of democratic institutions to the silent, patient pressure of organized crime. In the end, the rise and fall of Frank Costello is a uniquely American epic. It is a story of immigration, ambition, and reinvention, but it is also a dark reflection of the capitalist dream. A narrative where ambition curdles into greed and intelligence is weaponized for predation. He arrived on these shores as a penniless child from a poor Italian village, and through a combination of sharp intellect, ruthless determination, and a fundamental disregard for the law, climbed to a position of immense, albeit shadowy power. He achieved a perverted version of the American dream, demonstrating that the ladder to success could be built with corrupted timber. His long downfall, stretching from the Kefauver hearings to his final, quiet days, is a testament to the resilience, however slow and imperfect, of the society he sought to manipulate. The system eventually caught up with him, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding process of legal pressure and internal betrayal. The story of Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, is now complete. From the dusty roads of Calabria to the glittering peaks of New York power, and into the quiet obscurity of his final years, we have traced the entire arc of his extraordinary life. We have seen his philosophies forged in the streets of East Harlem, his empire built on the thirst of prohibition and the addiction of gamblers, his power cemented in the smoke-filled rooms of political kingmakers, and his authority ultimately shattered by the convergence of public scrutiny, federal persistence, and the treachery of a new, more violent generation. His life remains a compelling, complex, and deeply cautionary tale, a chapter from a hidden history that continues to shape our understanding of power, corruption, and the enduring allure of the underworld. The enduring fascination with Frank Costello lies not in the dramatic violence that punctuates the stories of so many of his contemporaries, but in the profound and unsettling questions his life raises about the very nature of power in a modern society. To simply label him a gangster is to miss the point entirely. He was something far more nuanced, and in many ways, far more dangerous. He was a systems architect, a corrupter of institutions, a man who understood that true, Lasting control was not exercised with a fist, but with a handshake, not through fear alone, but through a complex web of mutual benefit and unspoken obligation. His career stands as a dark testament to the idea that the most effective form of criminality is the one that seamlessly blends into the fabric of legitimate society, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the average citizen to discern where the government ends and the syndicate begins. This blurring of lines was his masterpiece. He operated in the gray area where politics, business, and crime converged, a space he navigated with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. While other mobsters were building fortresses, Costello was building bridges. Bridges into City Hall, into the judiciary, into the police department, and into the unions. He proved that it was possible to build an empire that was not a separate, hostile state, but a parasitic one, feeding off the lifeblood of the legitimate world while providing just enough service. A steady flow of illicit alcohol, a gambling outlet, a pliable union official, to create a perverse form of dependency. This is why his legacy is so difficult to quantify. You cannot point to a specific neighborhood and say, Costello ruled here, in the way you could with a street gang. His territory was not geographical, it was institutional. His domain was the backroom deal, the fixed case, the zoning variance granted for a favor, the contract steered to a friendly company. This form of power is invisible, yet all-pervasive, and consequently, far more resilient to direct attack. It is a virus that attacks the host's immune system first. The downfall of such a system, therefore, could not come from a simple arrest or a gangland hit. It required a fundamental shift in the environment itself. That shift began with the Kefauver hearings, which applied the disinfectant of sunlight to his operations, and was completed by the ambition of Vito Genovese, who reintroduced the blunt instrument of violence as a primary tool of control. In overthrowing Costello, Genovese didn't just replace one boss with another. He replaced an entire philosophy of governance. He traded the subtle, sophisticated model of a shadow government for the brutal, predictable model of a military junta. The subsequent chaos, epitomized by the Appalachian fiasco and the internal betrayals that followed, proved that Costello's way, for all its moral bankruptcy, was ultimately more stable and profitable. His story is a tragic irony. He was a man who was arguably too sophisticated for the world he inhabited, whose methods were too refined to survive the primal ambitions of his subordinates. In his later years, as he watched the organization he helped build descend into a cycle of paranoia and bloodshed, he must have felt a profound sense of failure, not for being caught, but for being misunderstood. The world had not evolved to match his vision. It had regressed. The final years of his life, from his release from prison in 1961 to his death in 1973, were a masterclass in strategic retreat. He understood that his time was over, that the spotlight was now permanently fixed on the world he had once ruled from the shadows. Unlike so many of his peers, he possessed the rare wisdom to accept this and fade away. There were no attempts to reclaim his throne, no desperate grabs for one last taste of power. He managed his remaining legitimate investments. He avoided the spotlight, and he maintained the silence that had always been his greatest shield. This quiet exit was, in its own way, his final victory. He died of natural causes in his own bed, an old man, a fate denied to almost every other kingpin of his stature. This peaceful end was not a matter of luck. It was the ultimate consequence of his life's strategy. By avoiding the messy, personal violence that created lifelong blood feuds, he had fewer enemies who were motivated by a need for personal vengeance. By cultivating an aura of a businessman rather than a thug, he remained beneath the visceral hatred directed at more violent figures. He passed from the world not as a martyr or a monster, but simply as a man, leaving behind a legacy that is as relevant today as it was in the mid-20th century. The lessons of Frank Costello are not locked in the past. They echo in every modern corruption scandal, in every instance where corporate power subverts political will, in every gray area where influence peddling blurs into outright crime. He demonstrated that the most significant threats to a free society are not always the ones that come from outside with the declaration of war, but the ones that fester within, wearing a nice suit and speaking the language of power and mutual benefit. His life is a permanent case study for law enforcement, a reminder to follow the money and the influence, not just the bullets. For the rest of us, his story is a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of power and the uncomfortable truth that the line between a powerful businessman and a powerful criminal is often just a matter of perspective and opportunity. The world has changed immeasurably since Costello's heyday, but the human dynamics of power, corruption, and ambition have not. The players and the stage may be different, but the game remains the same. To truly grasp the monumental scale of Frank Costello's influence, one must move beyond the man himself and examine the vast, intricate machine he helped to engineer and which he, for a time, commanded with such singular focus. This was not merely a collection of street thugs operating under a shared banner. It was a vertically integrated, multinational corporation with a diverse portfolio of illicit ventures, a sophisticated administrative structure, and a long-term strategic vision that would be the envy of any Fortune 500 boardroom. At the most fundamental level, the revenue streams were as varied as they were relentless, a constant flow of capital that empowered every other function of the syndicate. The bedrock, of course, was gambling. Costello's slot machine empire was a masterpiece of low-risk, high-yield logistics. Thousands of these armed bandits were placed in bars, restaurants, cigar stores, and union halls across New York and beyond. Each machine was a tiny, automated tax collector, requiring minimal oversight and generating a predictable and enormous cash flow. This was complemented by a sprawling network of numbers rackets and illegal bookmaking that reached into every neighborhood, a system that banked on the universal human hope for a life-changing win. But the financial engine did not stop there. Labor racketeering became a cornerstone of power and profit. By infiltrating and corrupting key unions, particularly in the waterfront, construction, and garment industries, The syndicate could paralyze the city's economy with a single phone call. They extorted businesses for protection from strikes. They embezzled from union pension funds. And they secured sweetheart contracts for companies they controlled. This control over labor provided not just money, but immense political leverage. A mayor or governor who crossed the organization could find their city or state gripped by inexplicable and crippling work stoppages. Another critical revenue pillar was loan sharking, known in the underworld as shylocking. In an era before widespread access to personal credit, the syndicate provided high interest loans to gamblers, small business owners, and individuals who had nowhere else to turn. The exorbitant vigorish, or interest, ensured massive profits, and the enforcement methods for late payments were terrifyingly effective, creating a cycle of debt and dependency from which few could escape. Beyond these core activities, the organization was involved in a vast array of other criminal enterprises, from traditional extortion and hijacking of cargo trucks to controlling the distribution of jukeboxes and vending machines, each a small tributary feeding into the great river of illicit wealth. This staggering income required a complex system of management and distribution. The money was meticulously collected, counted, and then laundered through a web of legitimate front businesses, restaurants, linen supply companies, vending machine operations, and later, real estate ventures, to obscure its origins and integrate it into the lawful economy. A portion was reinvested into the criminal operation to pay salaries, fund new ventures, and maintain the necessary infrastructure of corruption. Another significant portion was kicked up the chain of command, flowing from the street level soldiers to the capos, and from the capos to the boss, in this case Costello, who acted as the central banker for the family and its representatives on the commission. This financial structure was mirrored by a corporate-style organizational hierarchy. At the top sat the boss, the chief executive officer. Beneath him was the underboss, the chief operating officer, and the consigliere, the chief legal and strategic advisor. Then came the caporregimes, or captains, who functioned as middle managers, each overseeing a crew of soldiers who were the ground level employees carrying out the day-to-day operations. This structure provided deniability, efficiency, and a clear chain of command. Disputes between families were not settled through open warfare, but were mediated by the commission, a board of directors comprising the bosses of the most powerful families, which acted to arbitrate conflicts, sanction hits, and approve new members, ensuring the stability and profitability of the entire national syndicate. This was the cold, calculating, and breathtakingly efficient machine that Frank Costello oversaw. He was not a hands-on manager of street-level crime. He was the chief strategist, the ultimate fixer, the man who ensured the entire complex apparatus functioned smoothly by greasing its gears with political protection and enforcing its contracts with the unspoken threat of sanctioned violence. He understood that the true product this corporation sold was not gambling or loans, but impunity. The ability to operate with a semblance of safety, to have legal problems disappear, to secure favorable rulings and contracts. This was the invaluable service he provided, and it was this service that allowed the river of money to flow uninterrupted for so long. His genius was in recognizing that this criminal corporation could not exist as a separate entity. It had to become a silent partner in the legitimate world, its interests so deeply entwined with those of politicians, judges, and businessmen that to attack the syndicate was to risk destabilizing the city itself. This was the essence of his power, a power so deeply embedded in the system that it became almost invisible, a dark echo of the legitimate economy, mirroring its structures and exploiting its weaknesses for decades. The architecture of Frank Costello's power, for all its corporate sophistication and political insulation, was ultimately vulnerable to the most unpredictable of all forces, the turbulent currents of human ambition and the relentless, grinding pressure of a society slowly awakening to the corruption within its core. The year 1957 stands as the great watershed, the moment when the carefully maintained dam of silence and complicity began to crack, unleashing a flood of consequences that would eventually sweep away his reign. The attempted assassination by Vincent, the Chin, Gigante was not merely an attack on his life. It was a symbolic murder of his entire philosophy. The single gunshot in the lobby of his Central Park West apartment was a message written in the only language his rivals understood, a stark declaration that the era of diplomacy was over, and that raw, unchallenged force was once again the supreme law of the underworld. Costello's subsequent refusal to identify his assailant was a final, dignified, and profoundly tragic adherence to the old code. It was the act of a man who knew he had already lost, who understood that the world he had built no longer existed. By ceding power to Vito Genovese, he was not just surrendering control of a criminal family. He was acquiescing to the destruction of his life's work. The syndicate was now in the hands of a man whose paranoia and greed would, in short order, prove to be its own undoing. Genovese's desperate need for legitimacy, his desire to be formally recognized as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, led directly to the Appalachian Conference later that same year. This gathering, intended as a coronation, became a catastrophic exposure. The sight of dozens of America's most powerful crime lords, their expensive shoes muddied, their fine suits torn, being walked by state troopers through the quiet streets of a rural New York town, was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. It provided irrefutable, visual proof of the national crime conspiracy that J. Edgar Hoover had long denied existed. The fallout was immediate and severe. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies, now armed with undeniable evidence and intense public pressure, launched an all-out assault. Subpoenas flew, wiretaps were installed, and informants, once terrified into silence, began to see the crumbling edifice and calculated that cooperation might be their only path to survival. For Costello, now a private citizen in name only, the pressure did not abate. The government's case against him for income tax evasion, which had been temporarily stalled, was revived with renewed vigor. The legal system he had so masterfully manipulated for decades now turned its full, impersonal force upon him. In 1959, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His incarceration was the final, formal repudiation of his power. The man who had dined with judges was now an inmate, his fate entirely in their hands. The prison term, though he served only a portion of it, was a humiliating coda to a life of command. Upon his release in 1961, he returned to a city and a criminal landscape that were unrecognizable. The Genovese family was tearing itself apart from within, a direct result of its leader's disastrous policies. Genovese himself had been betrayed by his own underlings, including Carlo Gambino, and was now serving a lengthy prison sentence on a trumped-up narcotics charge, a poetic justice that Costello surely noted with grim satisfaction. The new generation, led by Gambino, was more cautious, more digitally paranoid, having learned from the Appalachian debacle. But the golden age of political influence that Costello had embodied was gone forever. The old Tammany Hall machine was broken, replaced by a more modern, media-sensitive political class that could no longer afford open alliances with mobsters. Costello spent his final years in this new world, a ghost from a more audacious time. He was wealthy, he was free, but he was powerless. He maintained a small office, tending to his legitimate real estate holdings, but he was ever conscious of the eyes upon him. The eyes of the government, the eyes of his former associates, and the eyes of history. He became a living relic, a source of whispered anecdotes and unverified legends. Younger mobsters might point him out in a restaurant with a sense of awe, but they no longer sought his counsel. His methods were considered antiquated, his connections obsolete. The world had moved on, embracing a brasher, more volatile style of criminality that would eventually lead to the flashy, self-destructive reign of John Gotti, a man who was the polar opposite of the discreet prime minister. Frank Costello's death in 1973 was thus not a dramatic conclusion to a life of violence, but the quiet expiration of a particular idea. He had proven that it was possible for a time to build a criminal empire that mimicked the state, that used intelligence and corruption as its primary weapons. His failure was not in his execution of this plan, but in his underestimation of the enduring power of envy, ambition, and the simple, brutal desire for dominance that defined the human animal, even those dressed in the finest suits. His legacy is therefore one of profound contradiction, a testament to the potential for order and structure within chaos, and a simultaneous, sobering reminder of the fragility of that order when confronted with the base instincts it attempts to suppress. He was the most successful failure in the history of American crime, a king who built a perfect throne, only to be pushed from it by those who could not comprehend the sophistication of his rule. The quiet passing of Frank Costello in 1973 did not signal the end of his story, but rather its transformation from lived experience into enduring legacy, a complex tapestry woven with threads of fear, respect, myth, and hard, cold historical analysis. In the immediate years following his death, the underworld he had helped structure continued its inexorable evolution. But the ghost of his methodology lingered in the shadows, a phantom blueprint for how things could have been had cooler and more calculating heads prevailed. The era of Carlo Gambino, who had deftly maneuvered into power following the downfall of Vito Genovese, represented a partial return to Costello's principles, an emphasis on low-profile, profit-driven operations and a deep aversion to the media spotlight. Gambino, in his own way, was a student of the Costello school, understanding that silence was golden and that headlines were a prelude to a prison sentence or a coffin. Yet, even this more prudent approach could not withstand the tectonic shifts in federal law enforcement. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, in 1970 provided prosecutors with a devastating new weapon, allowing them to target the entire structure of a criminal enterprise rather than just individuals for discrete crimes. This was the legal embodiment of everything Costello had built. It treated the mafia not as a collection of lone wolves, but as a corporation, and it held its leadership accountable for the collective actions of its members. The subsequent decades saw a parade of aging bosses, including Gambino's own successor, Paul Castellano, being convicted under this very statute, a bitter irony that would not have been lost on Costello. The tool he had perfected, systemic, organized criminality, was now the very thing that was systematically dismantling his successors' empires. The 1980s, with the rise of the flamboyant and volatile John Gotti, represented the final, utter repudiation of the Costello doctrine. Gotti, the dapper Don, was everything Costello was not. He craved the camera's gaze, he mocked the law, he orchestrated flashy murders, and he turned his own trial into a media circus. He was a throwback not to Costello, but to the earlier, more brutal era of Al Capone, believing that terror and celebrity were currencies more valuable than political connection. His very public downfall and life imprisonment served as a grim postscript to Costello's life, a cautionary tale that proved the Prime Minister's core thesis: visibility is vulnerability. Beyond the shifting dynamics of the underworld, Costello's legacy permeated the cultural consciousness. He became an archetype, a reference point for writers and filmmakers seeking to portray the cerebral, boardroom gangster. While the character of Vito Corleone in The Godfather is an amalgam of several figures, his strategic depth, his desire for legitimacy for his children, and his famous admonition to never let anyone outside the family know what you are thinking, are all traits that echo the real life philosophy of Frank Costello. He embodied the notion that the most powerful man in the room is often the quietest, the one who observes, calculates, and directs the action from a distance. This cultural immortality, however, often glosses over the profound social costs of his reign. The river of cash that flowed into his coffers was sourced from human misery. The broken lives of gambling addicts, the businesses crushed by extortion, the unions corrupted into serving mob interests instead of their members, and the fundamental erosion of public trust in civic institutions. His ability to corrupt police, judges, and politicians created a cynicism about government that persists to this day. A lingering suspicion that the system is rigged not by ideology, but by clandestine deals and envelopes of cash. The true, dark lesson of Frank Costello's life is that the most damaging corruption is not the kind that shouts and demands, but the kind that politely suggests and mutually benefits, the kind that seamlessly integrates itself into the machinery of power until it becomes an accepted, if unspoken, part of how things are done. For historians and biographers, the challenge of Costello has been to reconcile the man's personal demeanor, described even by his enemies as calm, charming and loyal, with the vast criminal enterprise he commanded. He was not a psychopath. He was a businessman whose business happened to be illegal. This very normalcy is what makes him so fascinating and so terrifying. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that the boundaries between the legitimate and the criminal worlds are not walls, but porous membranes, and that ambition, when divorced from morality, can find its most fertile ground in the gray areas between them. His life is a mirror held up to the American dream, reflecting a distorted image where success is achieved not through hard work and virtue, but through intelligence, ruthlessness, and a willingness to exploit the weaknesses of the system. The final resting place of Frank Costello, in a stately mausoleum in Queens, is a silent monument to this ambiguity. There is no overt symbolism of his power, no epitaph that speaks of his shadowy reign. It is the grave of a wealthy, respectable man, which is precisely what he always wanted to be. And in that success, in achieving that final, public veneer of legitimacy in death, lies the most complex and unsettling part of his entire story. He ultimately won his long game, not by defeating the system, but by convincing a part of it to bury him as one of its own, a final, perfect fix from the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The story of Frank Costello is in its final analysis, far more than the biography of a single man. It is a panoramic lens through which to view the evolving soul of 20th century America, a narrative that captures the nation's tumultuous transition from a collection of immigrant neighborhoods to a modern industrial powerhouse, and the dark, parallel government that grew in its shadows. To trace the arc of his life is to chart the institutionalization of American crime, a process he did not merely witness, but actively authored. From the gritty, formative streets of Italian Harlem, where the struggle for survival taught him the raw fundamentals of power, to the opulent, smoke-filled suites of the Waldorf-Astoria, where he perfected the art of its application. Costello's journey mirrors the country's own fitful ascent. He was a product of Prohibition, that great failed experiment in morality that unleashed an entrepreneurial gold rush for the ruthless, and he was a master of the post-Prohibition landscape, understanding before anyone else that the future lay not in the temporary vice of alcohol, but in the perpetual vices of gambling, labor control, and systemic corruption. His career stands as a stark rebuttal to the romanticized notion of the gangster as a rebellious folk hero. Costello was no charming rogue, but a cold-eyed capitalist of the illicit, a monopolist who sought to bring order, stability, and predictable profits to an inherently chaotic and violent trade. His great innovation was to recognize that the most valuable territory was not a city block or a waterfront pier, but the corridors of government and the courtrooms of justice. He commodified impunity, turning it into a service he could sell to his partners in the Syndicate, and in doing so, he built a criminal enterprise that was, for a time, more stable and more sophisticated than many of the legitimate corporations with which it coexisted. The Commission was his masterpiece, a United Nations of crime designed to manage competition and prevent the costly, attention-drawing wars that had characterized the earlier era. This was not the action of a mere thug. It was the strategic vision of a cynical statesman. A prime minister presiding over a shadow cabinet whose decrees shaped the lives of millions. From the dock worker who paid a portion of his salary to a mob-controlled union, to the city dweller who placed a bet with a neighborhood bookmaker, to the citizen who unknowingly voted for a politician whose campaigns were funded by illicit cash. His downfall, when it came, was precipitated not by a failure of his system, but by the inherent fragility of any system built on human greed and ambition. The very structure he helped create, the Commission, could not protect him from the ambitions of Vito Genovese, a man who represented the atavistic, violent past that Costello believed he had transcended. The bullet from Vincent Gigante's gun was a symbol of this regression, a brutal argument against diplomacy in favor of force. And in his refusal to identify his assailant, Costello was adhering to a code that his world was already in the process of abandoning, a final, tragic act of loyalty to a concept of order that was ceasing to exist. The subsequent decades have only confirmed the prescience of his methods and the tragedy of their abandonment. The convictions of the late 20th century mob bosses, from John Gotti to John Gotti's successors, almost all relied on the RACO statutes, a law that essentially prosecuted the corporate model of crime that Costello had pioneered. The government, in a sense, finally learned to fight the mob on Costello's own terms, by targeting the enterprise itself. His personal life remains an enigmatic coda to this epic of power, in a world characterized by betrayal and fleeting alliances. His long and stable marriage to Bobby was an island of constancy. He was, by many accounts, a generous man to those in his inner circle, a loyal friend, and a figure of his word. This dichotomy between the private man and the public criminal kingpin is the central mystery of his character, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that great evil, or at least great societal harm, can be administered not by cackling villains, but by intelligent, disciplined, and in their own way, principled individuals who have simply drawn their moral circle exceptionally small. Frank Costello's life forces us to ask difficult questions about the nature of power. The allure of the American dream and the porous boundary between ambition and criminality. He demonstrated that the most effective challenge to a democracy is not a revolution, but a slow, patient, and deeply insidious corruption from within, a process that enlists the very guardians of the system in its own subversion. His story is a permanent part of the American tapestry, a dark thread woven into the national fabric, reminding us that the pursuit of power, in any form, always carries a profound cost, and that the most enduring legacies are often those written not in light, but in the shadows we choose to ignore. The enduring enigma of Frank Costello, a puzzle that continues to captivate historians and crime enthusiasts alike, lies not in the sheer volume of his illicit wealth or the length of his reign, but in the profound psychological portrait he presents. The blueprint of a man who consciously willed himself into becoming an institution. To understand Costello is to delve into the mind of a master strategist who viewed emotion as a liability and violence as a tax on business. A man whose greatest weapon was his preternatural calm in a world defined by chaos. This was not an innate disposition, but a carefully constructed persona, forged in the fire of his early years on the streets of East Harlem, where he learned that the loudest man in the room was often the weakest, and that true power resided in the silent, observant calculation of odds and outcomes. He carried this lesson with him like a shield through the bootlegging wars of Prohibition, the boardroom negotiations of the Commission, and the political machinations of Tammany Hall, while his contemporaries like Lucky Luciano possessed a more raw, charismatic cunning, and Vito Genovese ruled through abject terror. Costello's authority was derived from a perceived inevitability, an aura of unshakable competence that made challenges to his rule seem not just dangerous, but irrational. He cultivated an image of the reasonable man, the ultimate arbiter whose decisions, while perhaps unforgiving, were always presented as the most logical and profitable course for the collective enterprise. This psychological dominance was his primary tool of management. He rarely needed to issue direct threats. The mere understanding of his connections, his wealth, and his strategic intellect was enough to ensure compliance. He managed his underlings not with shouts, but with silence, not with impulsive rage, but with a cold, disapproving gaze that could feel more terrifying than a pistol whip. This emotional detachment extended to his personal life, which he maintained as a fortress separate from his criminal endeavors. His marriage to Bobby was notably stable and insulated from his work, a sanctuary of normalcy that provided him with a crucial psychological anchor amidst the treachery of his professional world. Within the Syndicate, this detachment allowed him to make decisions with a chilling corporate efficiency. The authorization of a murder was not a personal vendetta, but a strategic necessity. A cost-benefit analysis weighed on the scales of organizational stability. He could sit across a table from a man, share a meal, and then later that evening sign his death warrant without a flicker of personal animosity, viewing it simply as a necessary piece of business. This ability to divorce action from emotion was the cornerstone of his longevity and his effectiveness. It was this very psychology, however, that also contained the seeds of his downfall. His belief that everyone could be reasoned with, that all conflicts could be resolved through back-channel negotiations and a fair distribution of profits, led him to fatally underestimate the atavistic hunger of Vito Genovese. Genovese was not a rational actor in Costello's model. He was driven by a deep-seated paranoia and a primitive lust for absolute dominance, forces that could not be appeased with a larger share of the slot machine revenue or a coveted political connection. Costello's cerebral, almost clinical approach to power left him psychologically unprepared for an enemy who operated on pure, unadulterated instinct for conquest. The attempted assassination was a form of communication he had never mastered, a language of pure force that rendered his entire philosophy of diplomatic power obsolete in an instant. His subsequent refusal to identify Giganti was less an act of honor and more the ultimate expression of his psychological makeup. A proud, calculating man who knew the game had changed to one he could not win, and who chose a dignified retreat over a messy, unwinnable war that offended his strategic sensibilities. In his final years, his psychology must have been a torturous landscape of regret and grim validation. He had the satisfaction of seeing Genovese's reign implode in a paroxysm of betrayal and the catastrophic exposure at Appalachian, events that perfectly vindicated his own low-profile methods. Yet, he also had to witness the gradual disintegration of the corporate empire he had built, as it descended back into the cycle of violence and flashy bravado he had worked so hard to eliminate. The rise of John Gotti would have been, to Costello, the final, maddening proof that his lessons had been entirely forgotten. Frank Costello's mind remains his most fascinating legacy, a perfect machine for criminal governance that was ultimately too refined, too logical, and too detached to survive the brutal, irrational realities of the world it sought to control. To fully appreciate the operational genius of Frank Costello, one must descend from the strategic heights of his political manipulations and examine the granular, day-to-day machinery of his criminal regime, a vast and intricate network that functioned with the relentless efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. This was not a loose confederation of thugs. It was a vertically integrated corporation with Frank Costello as its visionary CEO, and its business was the systematic exploitation of human desire and civic weakness. The most visible and most lucrative of his ventures was his slot machine empire, a logistical masterpiece that blanketed New York City and beyond. These were not merely coins clinking in a box. They were the automated infantry of his army, deployed in their thousands to bars, restaurants, drugstores, and union halls. The operation required a sophisticated support system, a team of mechanics to maintain the machines, a fleet of trucks and drivers for collection and redistribution, a network of bagmen to collect the cash and ensure the location owners received their cut, and a robust security apparatus to protect this valuable physical inventory from rivals and hijackers. The cash flow was astronomical, constant, and almost entirely untraceable, providing the liquid capital that fueled every other aspect of his enterprise. But his gambling interests extended far beyond the one-armed bandits. He was a central figure in the National Wire Service, which provided bookmakers across the country with up to the minute odds and race results, effectively controlling the flow of information that was the lifeblood of illegal sports betting. He had a significant stake in the Cuban casino operations run by his friend Meyer Lansky, and he controlled lucrative dice games and floating card games throughout Manhattan. This diversification ensured that if one revenue stream faced pressure, others would continue to flow unabated. Parallel to this was his deep and corrupting involvement in labor racketeering. By placing his associates in positions of power within key unions, most notably the longshoremen, the garment workers, and the restaurant workers, he gained a stranglehold on entire sectors of the city's economy. From the docks, he could extort shipping companies, pilfer cargo, and control the workforce. In the construction industry, he could ensure that mob-connected companies won lucrative contracts and that concrete was poured by his crews. This control provided a multi-layered yield. It generated direct cash through embezzlement and extortion. It provided legitimate, looking no-show jobs for his soldiers, and it granted him immense political leverage, as the threat of a crippling strike could bend City Hall to his will. Another critical pillar was loan sharking, the practice of lending money at exorbitant interest rates to those who had no access to traditional banks. The vig, or interest, on these loans could compound so quickly that a borrower could never escape the debt, becoming a permanent source of income or a pawn to be manipulated. The enforcement of these debts was a core function of his street-level soldiers, a grim reminder of the violence that underpinned the corporate facade. All of this immense, sprawling activity required a sophisticated administrative structure. The money was collected, counted, and then washed through a labyrinth of legitimate, seeming businesses. Cash from the slots would be recorded as revenue from his jukebox or vending machine operations. Money from loan sharking would be filtered through his real estate holdings or his partnership in the Piping Rock nightclub. A portion of the profits was kicked up the chain of command, from the soldier to the capo, and from the capo to the family's administration, with Costello as boss, receiving the largest share to fund his political operations and his lavish lifestyle. This entire edifice, however, would have been impossible without the final, crucial component, the fix. This was Costello's true specialty, the department he ran personally, his network of corrupted contacts within the police department, the district attorney's office, the courts, and the political world was his most prized asset. An arrest for one of his key operatives was not a crisis. It was a logistical problem to be solved with a phone call. A pending indictment was not a threat. It was a bill to be paid. He maintained lawyers on retainer who were not there to argue legal technicalities, but to deliver bribes and negotiate case dismissals with pliant judges. This system of protection was what allowed the machine to operate so openly and for so long. The slot machines were in plain sight. The bookmakers took bets openly in bars because the law had been preemptively disarmed. Frank Costello did not just run a criminal organization. He administered a parallel economy, a shadow city that operated within and upon the legitimate one, siphoning its wealth and corrupting its institutions with a calm, methodical, and breathtaking efficiency that remains the benchmark for organized crime in America. The year 1957 did not merely mark a turning point in the life of Frank Costello. It represented a seismic rupture in the very foundation of the American underworld. A year when the carefully constructed walls between the shadow government and the legitimate one crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance and the relentless pressure of a changing society. The first and most personal of these shocks was the attempted assassination, an event that resonated far beyond the superficial wound on Costello's scalp. The bullet fired by Vincent Gigante was a message crafted in the only language Vito Genovese truly understood, a stark declaration that the era of political persuasion and corporate diplomacy was over, supplanted by the primal law of the jungle. For Costello, a man who had built his entire empire on the premise that intelligence could supersede violence, this was not just an attempt on his life, it was a philosophical assassination. The fact that the attack occurred in the lobby of his own prestigious apartment building, a symbol of the respectability he had so tirelessly cultivated, added a layer of profound humiliation. His subsequent refusal to identify his assailant was a complex act, interpreted by some as a final, dignified adherence to omerta, but in reality, it was the ultimate strategic surrender of a man who knew the calculus of power had irrevocably shifted. He understood that naming Gigante would not lead to justice, but to an all-out war he was no longer equipped to win. A bloody conflict that would expose the fragile nature of his authority and likely lead to his own certain death. His quiet abdication in favor of Genovese was therefore not an act of cowardice, but a cold, clear-eyed recognition of his own obsolescence in this new, more brutal order. This internal coup was followed by an external cataclysm that would ultimately prove far more damaging to the entire national syndicate, the Appalachian Summit. Genovese, now seeking to legitimize his stolen authority, convened a meeting of over 100 crime bosses from across the United States at the rural New York estate of Joseph Barbara. This gathering, intended to be a coronation, instead became the single greatest self-inflicted wound in the history of organized crime. The image of the nation's most powerful mobsters, their expensive suits muddied as they fled through the woods, being rounded up by state troopers and federal agents, was broadcast across the nation. It was a spectacle of such stunning incompetence that it single-handedly demolished decades of careful secrecy and plausible deniability. For Costello, watching from the sidelines, it must have been a moment of bitter vindication. Genovese's heavy-handed, egotistical approach had achieved in one afternoon what J. Edgar Hoover had denied for decades. It provided irrefutable, photographic proof of a vast, coordinated criminal conspiracy operating on a national scale. The fallout was immediate and devastating. The public outrage was palpable, and the political pressure on law enforcement became immense and unrelenting. The FBI, along with state and local agencies, launched a coordinated assault on organized crime with a new level of intensity and resources. The age of quiet corruption was over. The age of the subpoena, the wiretap, and the relentless federal investigator had begun. For Costello, This new reality meant that the legal troubles he had once been able to smooth over with a phone call now became existential threats. His conviction on tax evasion charges and his subsequent imprisonment, though temporary, served as the final, official stamp on his downfall. The system he had gamed for so long had finally ensnared him. Upon his release, he returned to a world that was alien to him. The Genovese family was tearing itself apart in a paroxysm of paranoia and betrayal, a direct consequence of its leader's disastrous leadership. Genovese himself would soon be imprisoned, a victim of a fabricated drug charge orchestrated by his own subordinates, a fitting end for a man who believed only in treachery. The new generation of leaders, men like Carlo Gambino, were more cautious, having learned the harsh lessons of Apolachin. But the golden age of political influence that Costello embodied was a relic of the past. The old political machines like Tammany Hall were broken, and a new, more media-conscious political class had emerged. One that could not afford the taint of an open alliance with a publicly branded gangster. Frank Costello spent his final years as a ghost in this new world, a wealthy but powerless figure, a living reminder of a bygone era when a man could rule a city from a table at the Waldorf-Astoria. His long, quiet decline was the final chapter in the story of the Prime Minister, a man who had mastered the art of power, but was ultimately defeated by the very human forces of envy, ambition, and the relentless, unforgiving tide of history. The final act of Frank Costello's life, spanning from his release from prison in 1961 to his death in 1973, was a masterclass in strategic retreat and a profound study in the nature of power once its substance has evaporated. This was not a retirement in the traditional sense, not a peaceful sunset after a life of stormy seas, but rather a protracted and deliberate fading away, a conscious effort to become a ghost in the machine he had once operated. The world to which he returned was fundamentally altered, a landscape scarred by the revelations of Apolachin and the subsequent legal onslaught that had sent a generation of mob leaders scrambling for cover. The old rules, the unwritten codes of conduct that had governed the underworld for decades, were now largely obsolete, replaced by a pervasive paranoia and a desperate survival instinct. Costello, ever the pragmatist, understood this new reality with chilling clarity. He still possessed immense wealth, carefully laundered through his real estate holdings and other legitimate fronts, but he knew that the true currency of his life, influence, was now worthless. The political connections that had been his primary weapon were severed. The politicians who had once taken his money, now terrified of being associated with his publicly tarnished name. The organization he had helped build was now the Genovese family in name and in brutal practice, and though Vito Genovese himself was now imprisoned, the culture of suspicion and violence he had instilled remained. Costello's continued existence was a delicate balancing act. He was still a figure of immense historical significance, a walking repository of secrets that could topple empires, and this made him both a legend and a liability. He could not simply disappear. He had to manage his own irrelevance. he maintained a small, unassuming office, diligently tending to his remaining legitimate business interests, presenting the image of a retired, successful entrepreneur. He was careful, always so careful, to avoid any overt connection to the rackets that had defined his life. He knew that the eyes of the government were perpetually upon him, that federal agents monitored his movements, logged his contacts, and waited for a single misstep that could justify revoking his parole or bringing new charges. This constant surveillance was the price of his freedom, a life lived under a microscope. For the new generation of mob bosses, men like Carlo Gambino, Costello was a figure from a distant past, a respected but largely irrelevant ancestor. They might occasionally seek his counsel as a gesture of respect for the old order, a symbolic nod to the founding fathers of their syndicate, but they did not follow his methods. Gambino, though more low profile than Genovese, still ruled through a combination of strategic murders and iron-fisted control, a far cry from Costello's model of political insulation. The world was moving on, and the calm, cerebral authority that Costello had wielded was seen as a quaint artifact of a bygone era. His final years were thus a study in silence and observation. He became a living relic, a man out of time, witnessing the slow, inexorable decline of the empire he had helped architect. He saw the rise of new threats, like the RICO Act, which gave prosecutors the very tool they needed to attack the corporate structure of the mafia he had pioneered. He saw the advent of electronic surveillance, of wiretaps and hidden microphones, which made the quiet, back room conversations that were his specialty impossibly dangerous. He lived long enough to see the foundations of organized crime begin to crack under the relentless pressure of a modernizing state. His death in 1973, from a heart attack at the age of 82, was in keeping with the final chapter of his life. It was quiet, private, and undramatic. There was no gangland murder, no prison cell, no dramatic last stand. He died in his apartment. A wealthy man who had successfully navigated the perils of his world to die of natural causes, a fate denied to almost every one of his contemporaries of similar stature. This peaceful end was, in its own way, his final and perhaps greatest achievement. It was the ultimate consequence of his life strategy. By avoiding the petty, personal violence that created blood feuds, by operating as a businessman rather than a thug, he had fewer enemies motivated by a need for visceral revenge. He passed from the world not as a martyr or a monster, but simply as an old man, leaving behind a legacy of immense complexity and a quiet, unsettling question: who in the end was the more successful, the man who died in his bed, having lost his power, or the men who held onto it only to die in a hail of bullets or a prison infirmary? Frank Costello's final years were a testament to the fact that in the ruthless calculus of the underworld, survival itself can be the most ambiguous form of victory. The legacy of Frank Costello is a complex and enduring monument, not carved from stone, but woven from the contradictory threads of myth, memory, and hard, documented history. A legacy that continues to shape our understanding of power, corruption, and the elusive nature of the American dream itself. In the years and decades following his quiet death, his story did not recede into obscurity, but instead solidified into a foundational mythos for the American Mafia, a cautionary tale and a source of strategic wisdom for those few who could still decipher its lessons. For the underworld, he became the ghost at the feast, a constant reminder of a path not taken. His name was invoked not with the visceral fear associated with a Genovese or the flashy notoriety of a Gotti, but with a sense of respectful, almost intellectual awe. He was the benchmark for a certain kind of criminal efficacy, the master of the long game whose methods were studied even as they were abandoned. The subsequent implosion of the mob under the weight of the White Show Act, witness protection programs, and generational shift served as a grim, posthumous validation of his philosophy. The statute that finally crippled the 5 families was a legal mirror of the corporate structure Costello had helped create. The government, in essence, had finally learned to fight the Syndicate on his terms, prosecuting it as the criminal enterprise he had architected. The flamboyant self-destruction of John Gotti in the 1980s and 90s, a man who craved the spotlight Costello so assiduously avoided, stood as the ultimate repudiation of the Genovese model and a final, tragic proof that the Prime Minister's core tenets, silence, discretion, and political insulation, were the only sustainable strategy for survival beyond the confines of the underworld. Costello's influence seeped into the very fabric of American culture, becoming an archetype for the cerebral, boardroom gangster, while fictional characters like Vito Corleone are composites. The Don's strategic mind, his desire for legitimacy, and his famous dictum to never let outsiders know the family business are direct reflections of the real life principles that guided Frank Costello. He embodied the chilling notion that the most dangerous criminal is not the one who shouts his threats, but the one who calmly and rationally subverts the system from within, who wears a suit better than a prosecutor and understands the levers of power more intimately than a senator. This cultural immortality, however, often sanitizes the grim reality of his business. The rivers of cash that funded his political operations and his lavish lifestyle were drawn from a well of human suffering. The despair of the gambling addict, the fear of the extorted businessman, the corruption of public trust, and the systemic decay of civic institutions. His story is a permanent warning about the vulnerability of democracy to the slow, patient poison of organized corruption. It demonstrates that the most significant threats are not always external armies, but internal rot, the quiet, mutually beneficial deals that blur the lines between the legitimate and the illegitimate until the distinction becomes meaningless. For historians, the enduring challenge of Frank Costello is reconciling the man with the myth. He was, by many accounts, loyal to his wife, generous to his inner circle, and a man of his word within the twisted moral framework he inhabited. This personal decency, existing alongside his vast criminal enterprise, forces an uncomfortable confrontation with the nature of evil, suggesting it is not always a monster, but sometimes a calm, calculating businessman whose moral compass has been recalibrated to an entirely different north. His life is a dark reflection of the immigrant success story, a narrative where ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness achieve a perverted version of the American dream, proving that the ladder to success can be built with corrupted timber. His final resting place in a stately mausoleum is the ultimate symbol of this ambiguity. There is no marker of his notoriety, no hint of the prime minister of the underworld. It is the grave of a respectable, wealthy man, which is precisely what he always wanted to be. In that final, successful presentation of legitimacy lies the most complex and unsettling part of his entire story. Frank Costello ultimately won his long game, not by defeating the system, but by convincing a part of it to bury him as one of its own, a final, perfect fix from the man who proved that the most powerful criminal is the one you would never suspect. The story of Frank Costello, when viewed not as a linear biography, but as an intricate case study in the architecture of power, reveals a fundamental and enduring truth about the nature of organized crime and its symbiotic, parasitic relationship with the legitimate world. His career stands as a monumental refutation of the simplistic idea that criminal empires are built on fear and violence alone. Instead, he demonstrated that the most resilient and profitable empires are constructed on a foundation of mutual interest, strategic corruption, and a deep, systemic understanding of the host society's weaknesses. The genius of Costello was his recognition that the government itself was not an enemy to be defeated in open warfare, but a partner to be seduced, a system to be co-opted. He did not see politicians and policemen as adversaries. He saw them as potential assets, as human beings with desires, ambitions, and vulnerabilities that could be leveraged. His network of corruption was not a blunt instrument, but a precision tool, carefully calibrated to apply the minimum necessary pressure to achieve the maximum desired effect. A campaign contribution here, a no-show job for a relative there, the promise of union support during an election, or the discreet handling of a personal scandal. These were the threads he used to weave a web of obligation that ensnared City Hall, the courts, and the police department. This web was his most valuable asset, more important than any individual racket, because it was the mechanism that granted all his other ventures their license to operate. This model of criminal governance required a specific type of personality, one that Costello possessed in abundance: immense patience, a preternatural calm, and a strategic vision that measured success in decades, not days. While other mobsters were fighting bloody turf, wars over a city block, Costello was quietly securing a 30-year monopoly on the slot machine distribution for the entire eastern seaboard. He understood that the real battlefield was not the street corner, but the committee room. The real weapons were not Thompson submachine guns, but zoning variances, judicial appointments, and labor contracts. His infamous appearance before the Kefauver committee, where he refused to show his face but allowed the cameras to focus on his fidgeting hands, was a perfect metaphor for his entire approach to power. He preferred to operate just outside the frame, manipulating events from the shadows allowing only a glimpse of the anxiety that underpinned the entire enterprise. His downfall, when it came, was not the result of a flaw in his system, but a testament to its fragility in the face of a changing America. The post-war era, with its burgeoning middle class, its expanding media landscape, and its growing intolerance for the open corruption of the machine politics, created an environment where his methods became increasingly difficult to execute. The Kefauver hearings were the first great shock, applying the disinfectant of television sunlight to his operations. The ambitious, media-savvy politicians of the new era were harder to corrupt in mass than the old-school bosses of Tammany Hall, and ultimately he was overthrown by a man, Vito Genovese, who represented the very forces of atavistic violence that Costello's entire philosophy was designed to render obsolete. In the end, his story is a profound tragedy of failed transformation. He sought to lead organized crime out of the dark ages of bloody street battles and into a modern era of corporate style management and political integration. He succeeded, for a time, in building this sophisticated apparatus, only to see it seized and dismantled by those who neither understood nor valued its elegant complexity. The subsequent history of the American Mafia, the chaos of the 1960s, the narcissistic bluster of the Gotti era, and its eventual decimation by Reicchio prosecutions, proves that his vision was the correct one, even as it was ultimately rejected. Frank Costello's life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the boundary between the criminal and the legitimate is not a bright line, but a vast gray area of compromise, complicity, and mutual exploitation. His legacy is not merely a chapter in the history of organized crime. It is a permanent lesson in the vulnerabilities of democracy and the seductive, corrupting nature of power in all its forms. The final, quiet years of Frank Costello's life, from his release from prison in 1961 to his death in 1973, represent a period of profound and deliberate dissolution, a strategic unraveling of a persona that had taken a lifetime to construct. This was not a retirement of leisure and reflection, but a conscious and meticulous effort to de-escalate his own existence, to transition from a figure of immense, shadowy power to a ghost in the city he once ruled. The world he re-entered after his incarceration was one he barely recognized. The old landmarks of his influence were gone. The political machines were broken. The backrooms where deals were sealed were now monitored by federal wiretaps, and a new generation of mobsters, weaned on the paranoia of the Appalachian era, viewed him as a relic, a founding father to be respected from a distance, but whose counsel was no longer relevant to the brutal realities of their trade. Costello, with his unparalleled sense of situational awareness, understood this shift not as a personal insult, but as a geopolitical fact. He still possessed the trappings of his wealth, the real estate holdings, the investments, the comfortable apartment. But he knew that the substance of his power, the intricate web of obligation and fear, had been irrevocably torn. His primary occupation in these years was the management of his own irrelevance. He maintained a small, functional office, not as a command center, but as a stage prop to support the illusion of a legitimate, retired businessman. His movements were cautious, his associations carefully vetted. He was perpetually aware of the constant, silent scrutiny of federal agents who logged his every contact, hoping for a misstep that would justify a return to prison. This life under the microscope was the price of his fragile freedom, a constant reminder that the system he had once manipulated so effortlessly now held him in its unyielding grip. For the new ruling powers in the underworld, men like Carlo Gambino, Costello was a symbol of a bygone era. They paid him the respect one would accord a retired general, a nod to his historical significance. But they did not seek his strategic advice. The game had changed too fundamentally. The corporate model he had pioneered was now under direct assault by the Rights statute, a law that weaponized his own organizational innovations against his successors. The political corruption that had been his specialty was now riskier and less effective in a media-saturated age. The calm, diplomatic authority he embodied had been replaced by a colder, more volatile style of leadership. Costello became an observer, a silent witness to the slow, motion decline of the empire he had helped build. He saw the rise of new threats, not from rival gangs, but from technological advancements like electronic surveillance, and from a legal system that had finally developed the tools to combat organized crime on a strategic level. His own life became a testament to a different kind of survival, one not based on dominance, but on strategic withdrawal. He avoided the bloody internal purges that characterized the Genovese family after its namesake's imprisonment. He sidestepped the flashy, self-destructive trajectory of mobsters like Joe Gallo. He simply receded, allowing the tide of history to flow past him. His death in 1973 from a heart attack was, in its own way, the final and most perfect execution of his strategy. It was quiet, private, and devoid of the drama that had ended the lives of so many of his peers. He died in his bed, not in a hail of bullets or a prison cell, a fate that was arguably his last and greatest victory. In the ruthless calculus of the underworld, where life expectancy was a metric of success, Frank Costello had outmaneuvered them all. His peaceful passing was the ultimate consequence of his life's philosophy, that the most intelligent application of power is often the knowing of when to relinquish it, and that the ultimate goal is not to die a king, but simply to die an old man, your secrets intact, and your legacy a complex puzzle for future generations to decipher. His final years were not a defeat, but a masterfully managed retreat, the last, quiet move in a lifetime of strategic calculation. The cultural and historical afterlife of Frank Costello has proven to be as complex and multifaceted as the man himself. Evolving from a feared and respected underworld figure into a permanent archetype in the American imagination, a symbol of a specific and chilling form of power that operates not through brute force, but through intellectual dominance and systemic corruption. In the decades following his death, as the mafia's grip on American cities gradually loosened under the combined pressures of relentless federal prosecution, internal decay, and shifting demographics, the figure of Costello began to transcend, the gritty details of his criminal enterprises. He ceased to be merely a gangster and became instead a concept, a case study in the potential for a shadow government to flourish within a democracy. For historians and sociologists, his life provided a perfect blueprint of how organized crime could mature from a disorganized collection of street thugs into a sophisticated, quasi-corporate entity. His emphasis on political connections over pistol whippings, on boardroom negotiations over back alley ambushes, became the textbook model for understanding the mid-century zenith of the American mafia. He was the proof that the most effective criminal is not the one who inspires fear in the hearts of shopkeepers, but the one who inspires cooperation in the hearts of judges and mayors. This academic analysis, however, was paralleled by a more potent cultural metamorphosis. Costello's persona, the calm, impeccably dressed, and ruthlessly logical strategist, became a foundational template for a new kind of fictional gangster. While the character of Vito Corleone in The Godfather is an amalgam of several real-life figures, his quiet authority, his desire for legitimacy, and his profound understanding of power politics are direct echoes of Costello's real-life philosophy. Similarly, the television series Boardwalk Empire presented a version of Costello that highlighted his role as the national syndicate's cerebral fixer, a man who saw the bigger picture while others were lost in the bloody details of territorial disputes. This cultural canonization, however, carries with it inherent danger, the risk of romanticization, the portrayal of Costello as a wise, almost noble, criminal mastermind can obscure the profound human toll of his empire. The slot machines he so profitably monopolized drained the savings of working class families. The unions he corrupted served the interests of the mob, not their members. The politicians he owned made decisions that benefited his criminal enterprise at the expense of the public good. The cultural narrative often focuses on the charismatic boss in the fine suit, but it frequently forgets the addicts, the extorted businessmen, and the eroded public trust that were the true products of his system. This is the central duality of his legacy. He was both a visionary criminal executive and a profound corrupter of the democratic process. Furthermore, his life story has become a dark, alternative version of the classic American immigrant narrative. He arrived on these shores with nothing, and, through intelligence, ambition, and relentless will, achieved immense wealth and influence. But his story subverts the traditional moral of the tale, demonstrating that the ladder of success can be climbed with the tools of bribery, intimidation, and murder. He is the dark side of the American dream, a reminder that unbridled ambition, when divorced from ethical constraints, can lead to a perverse form of success that ultimately corrupts the very system that made it possible. Today, Frank Costello's name is no longer whispered in fear by politicians or printed in sensational newspaper headlines. Instead, it is studied in criminology classes, analyzed in history books, and immortalized on screen. His physical empire of slot machines and corrupt unions is long gone, but his metaphysical empire, the idea that power is best exercised from the shadows through intelligence and influence, endures. He remains the benchmark against which other criminal masterminds are measured, not for the body count he accrued, but for the political heights he scaled. His story is a permanent part of the American tapestry, a dark thread that reminds us of the fragility of our institutions and the constant, insidious threat posed by those who seek to weaponize the system for their own ends. The legacy of the Prime Minister of the Underworld is, therefore, a warning etched not in stone, but in the annals of history, a cautionary tale that remains as relevant today as it was at the height of his power. The story of Frank Costello, now nearing its final summation, demands a reckoning that stretches beyond the chronological facts of his rise and fall and into the deeper, more philosophical questions his life poses about the American experience, the corrupting nature of power, and the enduring myth of the self-made man. To assess Costello is to grapple with a profound and unsettling contradiction. He was a man of immense personal discipline and loyalty who presided over a vast network of exploitation and corruption. He was a visionary who brought a semblance of order to a chaotic underworld. Yet that very order inflicted deep and lasting wounds upon the legitimate society it pried upon. His biography is a direct challenge to the simplistic moral binaries that we often prefer, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable gray areas where ambition curdles into criminality and intelligence is weaponized for predation. He was not a monster in the classic sense. He was not a psychopath who reveled in violence. By all accounts, he was a calm, thoughtful, and even charming individual, a man who could be a generous friend and a devoted husband. This very normalcy is what makes his legacy so terrifying. He proves that the capacity for immense societal harm does not require a twisted psyche, but can spring from a simple, immoral calculus, a cold-eyed decision to pursue wealth and power by the most efficient means available, regardless of the legal or human cost. His life is a dark mirror held up to the core tenets of the American dream. He embraced the ethos of rags to riches ambition of self, invention, and relentless drive. But he followed that path into a shadow world, creating a blueprint for success that was entirely separate from and hostile to the values of the society he inhabited. He took the immigrant's dream of a better life and perverted it into a quest for a different kind of kingdom, one built not on hard work and virtue, but on cunning, corruption, and control. In this sense, Frank Costello is one of the most authentically American figures of the 20th century, a living embodiment of the nation's raw, unvarnished capitalist spirit, channeled into the ultimate free market of illicit enterprise. His long reign and his eventual downfall also tell a broader story about the resilience, however slow and imperfect, of American institutions. For decades, his system of political protection seemed impregnable, a perfect fusion of criminal power and governmental authority. But it was ultimately vulnerable to the forces of a free press, as seen in the Kefauver hearings, to the ambition of rival gangsters like Genovese, and finally, to the slow, grinding wheels of justice. His conviction on tax evasion charges was a powerful symbol that no one, not even the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was entirely above the law. The system, though deeply compromised, eventually managed to correct itself, to expel the parasite, even if it took decades to do so. This offers a cautious, hopeful lesson about the enduring strength of democratic structures, even when they are severely tested. Yet, the most haunting aspect of Costello's story may be its timeless relevance. The specific rackets of slot machines and labor union extortion have evolved, but the underlying principles of his power have not. The seamless movement of illicit wealth into legitimate businesses, the use of campaign contributions and lobbying to shape legislation and secure immunity, the exploitation of legal loopholes and the corruption of public officials. These are not historical artifacts. They are dynamics that persist in new forms, a constant feature of the landscape where vast wealth and power converge. Frank Costello's true legacy, therefore, is not locked in the past. It is a permanent warning about the vulnerability of democracy to the quiet, patient, and insidious force of organized corruption. He demonstrated that the greatest threat to a free society is not always a foreign invasion or a violent revolution, but the slow, steady erosion of its ethical foundations from within, a process facilitated not by monsters, but by calm, rational, well-dressed men who understand the price of everything and the value of nothing. His life forces us to ask ourselves where the line between a shrewd businessman and a criminal truly lies, and to remain eternally vigilant against those who seek to blur it for their own gain. The echo of Frank Costello is heard in every headline about political scandal and corporate malfeasance. A ghostly reminder that the battle for the soul of a nation is not fought only on battlefields, but in boardrooms, in legislative chambers, and in the quiet, shadowy spaces where power is brokered and sold. And so we arrive at the final, quiet conclusion of our story, the end of the long and complex narrative of Frank Costello, a man whose life was a grand and ambiguous tapestry woven with threads of brilliance, ambition, corruption, and a profound, perhaps unintended, commentary on the nation he both exploited and embodied. His journey, from the impoverished village of Loropoli to the pinnacle of American criminal power, and then into the quiet obscurity of his final years, is now complete before us. We have traced his rise from the gritty streets of East Harlem, where he learned the foundational lessons of power and survival, through the bootlegging bonanza of Prohibition that provided the capital for his ambitions, and into his masterful construction of a corporate-style syndicate where gambling, labor racketeering, and political corruption were managed with the cool precision of a Fortune 500 CEO. We witnessed his zenith, where he held court at the Waldorf-Astoria as the undisputed Prime Minister of the Underworld, a man who believed he had transcended the violent roots of his profession through the sheer force of intellect and influence. We then followed his agonizingly long fall, precipitated by the convergence of a changing America that would no longer tolerate his brand of open corruption. The televised scrutiny of the Kefauver hearings that stripped him of his anonymity. The betrayal of Vito Genovese that shattered his philosophy of diplomatic power. And the final, humbling reality of a prison sentence that proved no one was truly above the law. We have seen him in his final act, a ghost of his former self, managing his own irrelevance with the same strategic patience he once used to manage an empire, until his quiet death in 1973 closed the book on one of the most significant criminal careers in American history. The entire, sprawling saga, from shocking beginning to contemplative end, has been laid before you, pieced together from the historical record with the sole purpose of presenting the complete and unvarnished truth. The life of Frank Costello leaves us not with a simple moral, but with a series of profound and lingering questions. Was he a success because he died an old man in his bed, wealthy and free, unlike so many of his rivals? Or was he a failure because the sophisticated corporate empire he built was ultimately seized and dismantled by lesser men, his vision rejected in favor of a more brutal and self-destructive path? His story challenges our very definitions of victory and defeat. He was a man who achieved the American dream in its purest, most ruthless form, immense power and wealth forged from nothing by his own wit and will. Yet he did so by creating a parasitic version of that dream, one that fed on the weaknesses of the legitimate world. He remains the ultimate paradox, the civilized barbarian, the respectable gangster, the quietest and most dangerous man in the room. His legacy is a permanent part of the American story, a dark chapter that teaches us that the greatest threats to our society are not always the ones that confront us openly, but the ones that insinuate themselves quietly into the halls of power, wearing a nice suit and a calm smile. The story of Frank Costello is over, but its echoes are timeless. This concludes our comprehensive 20-part series on Frank Costello. If this deep, immersive journey into the heart of a hidden history has been of value to you, if it has provided insight, captivated your imagination, or simply offered a compelling story, then your support would be deeply appreciated. The creation of such detailed and thoroughly researched content is a significant undertaking, and your engagement is what makes it possible. If you have not already, please consider showing your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell to ensure you do not miss our future explorations into the untold stories and complex figures that have shaped our world. We are committed to bringing you the most accurate and engaging historical narratives, and we thank you sincerely for your time, your attention, and your partnership in this journey. Thank you for listening.